I will be happy to draw us into this space. And I'm actually going to share with you. So in addition to my work at CTS, I'm also an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ. And on the UCC website, they have what I find to be a beautiful prayer in this time, an important prayer in this time as we think about the suffering that's happening in Ukraine. So I invite you to be in a spirit of prayer with me. Holy God, hear our prayers for all those who will die today because of war in Ukraine and other war-torn countries all over this world. Grant them an end to the suffering of this world and eternal peace that is only found in you. We pray for the people of Ukraine, Russia, and all nations, that war and bloodshed can be avoided and a new, just peace can be forged out of this crisis. We ask God grant wisdom to the leaders of nations, calling them to end provocation on all sides and invest instead in the things that make for peace, as called for in all our faith traditions. We pray for an end to the deep insecurity and mistrust on all sides, and call on leaders to build trust based not on military might or alliances, but on the basis of our shared future and common humanity. Now is a time in which past harm should be acknowledged and addressed, and new partnerships can be envisioned. We pray for and call on our leaders to have the courage to take small, verifiable, and independent steps toward peace, inviting others to reciprocate. Now is the time to invest in conflict resolution, diplomacy, and international cooperation, not more weapons which only escalate tension in the region. Be with those suffering in ways that we cannot. Protect them from devastation in ways those positioned in authority will not. Shield and comfort them as they confront the terror of violence that surrounds them. Hold them close to your heart and stay the hand of the enemies against them. Give us the courage and strength to cry aloud against wickedness in high places that dare to harm others made in your image. Comfort the children and heed their cries to be saved from harm in this world. Make us a people who love our children, all of our children, more than we love greed, power, and control. Overturn governments of tyranny wherever they are found, disrupt the intentions of evil, and give us power to stand against demonic forces of greed and control. Grant that peace and justice come to warring nations by the hands of those courageous enough to stand and study war no more. Let thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven, we pray. Amen. Friends, today, switching gears, we are talking about evolving worship and ministry in the wake of COVID. 2 years ago, we were all scrambling to figure out virtual worship and struggling to make connections online. And we're now at a place where gathering is again possible, but I think it's safe to say we're not going back to what we used to be. So we wanted to take some time today to engage in discussion about what we've learned, what we're experimenting with, how we are evolving and changing. And we have 2 guests to help guide this conversation. And I hope this is a conversation that those who are gathered will also contribute your voices today. I'd like to welcome Reverend Anne Louise Haack today. Anne Louise was called as the pastor of Wellington Avenue UCC Church effective June 1st of 2020. She believes that great things lie ahead for that committed community of faith, and she embraces her call with joy and excitement as Wellington embarks on a new chapter and turns its focus toward the future. Here are some fun facts about Anne Louise. She and her partner, Dr. Shelby Hatch, have lived in the Rogers Park neighborhood in Chicago for over 20 years. Together, they have raised and are still raising 2 sons who are now young adults. Anne Louise holds degrees from Grinnell College and from Chicago Theological Seminary. She says that both of those institutions have shaped her in myriad ways. She's an ordained American Baptist minister and previously served Lake Street Church in Evanston as their associate minister and First Slice Pie Cafe as their executive director. She has more hobbies than she has time for and would love to talk to you about knitting, gardening, biking, racial justice and white privilege, baking, mixology, and of course, the divine. And Anne Louise will be joined today in conversation with our own Reverend Brian Smith, and I will turn the conversation to the two of you. Welcome.
Welcome, everyone. And certainly I'm grateful for this opportunity to share with not only a fellow colleague in ministry, but a fellow alum of Grinnell College. And the fascinating thing is we both attended college at the same time, have some of the same friends, but we only met here recently. And, when we began to talk, I'm like, wait a minute, you on the campus at that time? I was there at that time. So it's just fun to be around folk who were close to you, yet we were far away. Grateful to be in your presence, Reverend Hawk. And as we move the conversation forward, both of us are pastors of congregations, and we both had to wrestle with how to serve our congregants and protect them. Serving them, making sure that we're making contact with them, but protecting them from a deadly virus that transfers through the air. And so in both of our congregations, we had to make, well, most congregations had to make this decision, but now we are faced with a new phase of the pandemic where it seems like it's over. However, we know that there's still the possibility that people can become infected. And we have seen our ministries transformed during the past 2 years. So I'm going to first ask you, Reverend Hawk, to talk about how your congregation transitioned during that first entrance of the pandemic and where you are now.
Yeah, so our congregation entered the pandemic from an unusual position, I think, compared to lots of other congregations. Wellington, formerly called Wellington Avenue UCC, had been a faith community in the Lakeview community on the north side of the city for over 110 years with a glorious, big, old building that was no longer the right size space for the congregation. So about 4 months before the pandemic, the congregation had actually voted to sell the church building and to move into a new chapter as a faith community without a physical location. And in some ways, COVID descended and folks pivoted, my favorite pandemic word, to worship through Zoom. And it was the timing of it all was an odd gift for this particular congregation. Like many congregations, we are small and we are well endowed with elders. And the pandemic, forced us all to embrace new technology and new ways of being together that actually then paved the way for a smoother transition into a life without a building, if that makes any sense. So, Wellington shifted to online worship in March of 2020, and we have mostly been there ever since. We had anticipated that it would take us 12 to 18 months to sell the building. That was pre-COVID. It actually ended up taking us 3 months to sell the building. So in the midst of a global pandemic, we also sold our spiritual home, said goodbye to it without being able to gather for that final farewell worship service. And so had to really creatively think about ways to do release and, bidding our fond farewells to a place that held so many powerful memories and moments for all of us. And then figuring out, it just like our timeline and our process totally shifted because of the pandemic. So we found a way to worship online that works really well for our congregation. We do live Zoom worship every Sunday. And so it's like, it's real and interactive, and it's, attendance went up, and folks who'd moved to other parts of the country started coming back to worship. And we actually have, it's so super sweet. We have cousins of somebody's mother who live in Cornwall, England. And they started joining us for worship during the pandemic. And when their local parish shut down and whatever they were doing, whatever their parish in Cornwall was doing wasn't a fit for them. So they came to join us one Sunday, and Margaret and David still join us almost every single Sunday at tea time. Their church has reopened, so they go to their parish church and they go to service in person in the morning. And then at tea time on Sunday afternoon, they sit down in their red chairs in Cornwall, England, and they Zoom in and join us for worship. So, we are in a slightly different place than lots of other congregations. Like, we don't have a building that is waiting for us to resume in-person worship services in it. Right. So what we have done during this time is that we decided last summer that we would meet in person on the first Sunday of the month so that we could celebrate communion together in a COVID cautious kind of way. And we are also in this season of figuring out where we want to settle down next as a congregation. So we are doing these 6-month residencies, I call them, where we settle in different parts of the city in different configured spaces to test out what it feels like. We're very nomadic. Some days it feels like we're in the wilderness. Some days it feels like there's manna abundantly raining down upon us. So we did a 6-month residency in the Pilsen Little Village neighborhood. That's actually where we have some rented office space for the church in a partner organization's building. And our space was big enough that we were able to configure a little sort of chapel area and do in-person worship that is also streamed live over Zoom. So it's hybrid. So we were there for 6 months and experiencing what it was like to be outside of our comfort zone in a neighborhood that is not home to most of us, where English is not the dominant language. And now we're starting our next 6-month residency on Sunday. We took a little break because of Omicron in December and January and February, and we didn't meet in person at all. But now we're starting our second residency this Sunday. We're going to be renting some space from Centro Romero up here on the north side of the city. They have a storefront that they are using as a youth-run, youth-curated art gallery. So that will be our gathering place on first Sundays and also on Easter for the next 6 months. So.
That's a fascinating testimony. And I heard you use the word release, and you made me think about my congregation.
Yeah.
And how I entered the congregation under the terms of a release. I actually started serving the congregation around the same time that I started at CTS. So in my mind, I already had a ministry site at CTS. And the president at the time, Dr. Stephen Ray, would say to me, don't pastor the church because we need all your energy at CTS. So I was in a unique circumstance whereby a good friend who was also in my DMin program became ill. And this was in, right before January 2019. And I filled in for her a couple of Sundays in January. And I said, well, listen, I don't want you to have to go through the struggle of having to try to identify a preacher each and every week and trying to keep the congregants together, so on and so forth. So I volunteered to continue to support her. And I said, well, once you get through your treatments, because she had indicated she had cancer, once you get through your treatments, I will obviously hand the church back over to you. I was not aware at the time that she had a very aggressive form of cancer, and she ended up passing away 5 months later. Mm. And so I took on this grieving congregation also as I was serving CTS. And under the circumstances, obviously, you're not going to leave a wounded congregation at that time, because that really wasn't my plan. I had not planned to pastor full time in that capacity. And so I continued to shepherd them, continued to, and the word I honed in on when you spoke was release, because I had to guide them not only through the pain of bereavement, and then I had to deal with my own bereavement because this was a dear friend and we were in very intensive study together. And I had no idea how ill she was, but I had to help them to go through this process of grieving, and I had to help them to move forward. I had to remind them that even though they were a small congregation, they were in fact a church. And so I preached a lot on ecclesiology, and I just reminded them over and over that they are the body, and that yes, we serve as pastors, as leaders, but they have to continue to be that body. So several months pass, we get to January 2020, and they say, well, Reverend Smith, would you be our senior pastor? And I said, wow. At that point, like a relationship, I said, well, of course, I'll continue to serve you. And then 2 months later, the pandemic hits. So you go from helping a congregation to go through this form of release, helping them to go through this process. And actually during the process, membership increased steadily. But now we have a new phenomenon, a new challenge. Now, we did not have a formal home to call our own. We were renting. So immediately I realized that, we were depleting resources, and I renegotiated the lease, so on and so forth, and began to bring down expenses. And then when COVID hit, we stopped renting, and membership increased, and offerings increased, and we had half the people participating that were in states, and it's still that way now. Half of the participants, the people that come face to face, are from other states, at least 5 states every Sunday. And so now we have the scenario where the church is growing during the pandemic. Not only that, I'm beginning to work with 50 other congregations at CTS, all simultaneously. So the beauty was, my individual work was informing my work at CTS. And so when I'm communicating with pastors, I'm coming with a level of authority and experience that they understand. And it's informing the work I'm doing as far as trying to help them to boost their capacity to do virtual ministry. So I'm helping my congregation and 50 others. And I joked with my congregation that I'm doing better work for the congregations at CTS than my own, because we don't have a website. I'm helping everybody get websites. I said, wait a minute. And my congregants are coming to the sessions that I'm doing for CTS, but they didn't complain. They appreciated that their pastor was involved. But during this process, we gained such a surplus that when I looked at the offerings in the books, I said, guys, we can't hoard all these resources. So we took about 5 different community organizations in the northern suburbs, and we took 10% of our holdings and we gave to all of them. And we continue to do so. But now we've reached a stage where we've been blessed with a surplus. So now my congregation has identified a potential site to acquire. But one of the things that I'm teaching in a cohort at CTS is that we should become a part of the local ecosystem and not just build a big, pretty structure where we just go in and feel good and we leave. So the structure we've identified is a former medical clinic. And what we want to do is build an extension to that for multi-purpose use, but also reinvigorate that clinic, because half my members are in healthcare and half are educators, and then do a med tech center. So now we're going through the feasibility study to look at the site, and I've met with the mayor and done some of that work, the preliminary work, to see about acquiring this site. But we are, as I look at your congregation, we're sort of converging on this concept of maintaining a hybrid approach to worship, so that we don't forsake the assembly and we give people some opportunity to meet face to face. So I'm wondering, are you feeling any level of pressure to engage in face-to-face worship and to alter how you're actually operating now?
I mean, if anything, I would say we're dealing with I'm dealing with some of the reverse pressure, right? So as one of my members who's in his 80s has said, he's like, this online church is really great. He's like, I can wake up at 10:15 on Sunday morning, and by 10:30, I can be in my pew in the kitchen with a fresh cup of coffee. He's like, so I think, the struggle we are having is actually getting people off of their screens and like making the effort to dress your full body, not just your top half, and like get in the car and go somewhere and, find your keys that you haven't used in 4 days and whatnot. So, but we too are, it is a real challenge. I mean, we are like, Wellington, it's a small social justice congregation, right? We are so low tech. It would have never occurred to this congregation in a million years to have any sort of online ministry. Like, that is just not who we are. Well, guess what? Now it is who we are forever and ever. Amen. And so there is a real holding of like, how do we honor all the parts of the body? The parts that are here in Chicago, the parts that are far away, the parts that can physically gather for worship, and, the parts who have health challenges, and like they are able to remain connected in fellowship through Zoom worship in a way that would not be possible for them if the only option was to be present physically on a Sunday morning. So I see. Oh, so, Marie put this question in the chat, how do you deal with sacraments, weddings, funerals, baptisms, communion? I have not done a Zoom wedding yet. We have done some memorial services, celebration. We've had one, and we have one that we need to figure out how to do. We have not had any baptisms, and for communion, actually, one of the things that I do is that I'm also, I love to bake. I'm a baker. And so when we do communion, we always have two co-celebrants. That is our tradition in our congregation. So now I bake 2 loaves of bread, and whoever is the co-celebrant gets a loaf of bread delivered to their home, so that we are breaking the same loaf together on our separate screens. But for everyone else, it's a DIY communion. Although there was one time when I was super ambitious. Pastors got creative and ambitious during the pandemic. Now we're kind of running out of fuel, but there are a bunch of folks in the congregation who don't, they either can't or try to avoid gluten. And so I made a bunch of gluten-free bread, and then the communion fairy went around to their houses. And if you were gluten-free, you got special gluten-free communion bread dropped off at your house. I'm not doing that every month. That was like a couple times. That was enough.
So for me, I have done 2 weddings during the pandemic, not direct members of my congregation, but very close associates. And I actually prayed both times, because one was right in the midst of the rise of Omicron. And I remember talking to a colleague, and I said, man, I really don't want to do this. I mean, it were 150, 200 people there. And I actually did the wedding, and then they said, you got to be at the reception too. And I'm like, oh gosh. So I did both. Tried to keep the mask on. That didn't work.
I was praying for you. I was praying for you through that whole wedding.
Yeah, I told you about that. Yeah, I did it. And I tried to avoid it. I've done a couple of funerals where I made appearances. As far as baptisms, I haven't done any. I'm hoping though that I'm planning on one now when it gets warm outside Lake Michigan. It's a blessing being close to the lake here in Lake County. As far as sacraments, we have communion services on the first Sunday of each and every month. I notify folks a week ahead of time, let them know that they need to purchase their elements. And so now whenever I go to the store to buy bread, my son is saying, is that for communion? Is that for communion? And, I get the bread, and then we have it as a family. And then I encourage all the congregants to have it. And I bless the sacraments visually. That works out pretty well. Although my daughter did tell me, Dad, I ran out and I had to use a hot dog bun. I said, well, baby, whatever it takes, baby. We understand that these are symbols. You take that hot dog bun and you break it and you lift it up to God. And so we've all had to make adjustments. I will say, I've had maybe a quarter of my congregants that have come to me and they've said, Pastor, I love you. I love the church. I just can't do Zoom. And so they will listen to the sermons. I do Facebook live sermons, and they'll listen to those. The beautiful thing is they continue to give. So I realized that we have to have an assembly space that's going to have to be hybrid. And that's kind of, I'm not investing a whole lot to have, a space that will have 2,000 people. I'm thinking 40 folks, and then equipping it. I really like that concept that we saw with the NBA, where they had the big screens lining the arena. And I'm thinking of trying to build something like that in this space. Here's a great question from Marie. At this stage of the pandemic, do you visit hospitals, hospice, etc.? Reverend, I'll let you talk first.
Yeah, I mean, I do. it's, with the constantly changing rules about different facilities, it it can be hard. I mean, it can be hard to get access. But there are a couple of people who we haven't had anyone in hospice. We have had some people in hospital. We did have someone who passed away in the hospital. And so, thanks be to God that they were willing to, let us come in and have some final prayer and time and, be with family. So I was grateful to that. I mean, that feels like a gift in these times, to be able to be with people at those moments and not just on the other side of a screen. I mean, we are, our faith, the Christian faith is an embodied faith. Like I think incarnation takes all sorts of forms and shapes during the course of our lives. And so, like, these bodies matter, right? We were given them for reasons. And I mean, one of the protocols we've had to negotiate, I'm sure lots of you have as well, is when we do gather in person, like some people are like, oh my gosh, it's been so long since I've seen another human being. I want to give you a hug. And we've had to like work on our communication and our protocol of like, now consent during passing of the peace is a whole new thing that it, in a way it wasn't before. So, figuring out like, how do you balance being respectful of where people are in terms of the amount of contact they feel comfortable having with other people, so who's the fist bumper, who's the elbow knocker, who is willing and grateful to receive an actual hug from another live human being,
Yeah, my experience has been that hospitals have been more restrictive, and you really have difficulty getting access.
Yeah.
So I haven't had that experience per se. I have gone to homes. That works out pretty well for me. And I have visited, like I have some seniors that don't necessarily enjoy Zoom. So I've been able to go. I had one senior who had a birthday party, and it was just me and her family. They invited me, the pastor came, and I celebrated with them. So in individualized context, I'm able to connect with members. But again, that is a big issue because we have to be considerate of folks that have autoimmune responsive diseases and people that may have compromised immune systems. You can't make these assumptions that you can just go and breathe on people. And it's difficult because especially like me, when I saw you, I mean, we both said we're huggers and bam, we grabbed each other, but you can't assume and do that to people, and God forbid, spread something to them, which is why I guess this hybrid form of worship is here to stay. And still we have children that are unvaccinated. And I don't think that we are, and I say we broadly, I don't think we're fully considering everyone and how they're being impacted. I've worked with my colleague Marie trying to do vaccine clinics, and I've had a couple of experiences where I've been in close proximity with people in a church environment and other spaces. And it's always tempting to let your guard down. And that could be the point where someone becomes vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
I appreciate, let's see here. I have Lisa saying, I appreciate the conversation around consent as we live with a pandemic. Consent. you can't assume that everybody is in the same place. And we have almost 1 million people that have passed away. People still dying. Yeah. And we have a large segment of our country that's saying, well, we got to move forward no matter what. Well, as faith leaders, as shepherds, we have to consider all the sheep that are grazing in the pasture. Mm-hmm. We have to consider those who are still struggling, whether it be with the trauma, the idea of being ill, or actually the threat of being ill. So how is your, have you instituted any specific policies with respect to people touching each other? Have you had to preach about it?
No, I haven't had to preach about that, but we did, we had a big conversation. I mean, I took it to the church council this past month, and I said, okay, restrictions are lifting, and we are gonna start meeting in person again. So what are our protocols going to be? Like, what do we feel is the best decision for the health, the well-being, and the health and safety of our congregation? And how are we going to communicate that clearly so that people understand that they are welcomed? Like, we want to practice hospitality, right? We want people to be welcomed, and we also need for people to be safe and healthy. So, we're in Chicago, and we're small, and we are homogenous in our political views in my congregation. It's mostly a blessing for me. This makes things a little easier on the pastor, but the council said, for people to come and join in-person worship, you need to be vaccinated and you need to be boosted if you're eligible. And, we're going to ask, we're going to make a little database of the church where, you send in the picture of your card and we have you on the list. And if you're not on the list, you got to show that you're vaccinated, and and that we also have clear signage and communication, like on our website. It's actually not on our website because we're redesigning it right now, but so that we have a sign at the door and the person at the door knows what to say. Like, not that I think a lot of people are going to be like, oh, look, new storefront church, I think I'm going to walk in on a Sunday morning, right? I don't think we're going to have a lot of that traffic, but so that we communicate clearly, like, if you are not able or not willing to be vaccinated, we'd love to have you join us for worship. Come join the stream. If you're vaccinated and boosted, join us on the stream, or come join us when we meet in person, but to just make sure that we have really clear, consistent, repetitive communication, so that, I don't want anyone to interpret our caution with the health and well-being of our congregation to be interpreted as limiting the welcome of God.
That's a great way to begin to look at it in terms of not only the welcoming of God, but the protection of God. Yeah. And that's where I think we get into this debate, because some people want to say, everything is okay. We should be able to just go back to normal. And we're very
normal has broken up with us permanently. Normal is never coming back. We're done with that relationship.
That's right. And it's a new, as a pastor told me, we're going to be dealing with the new abnormal. That's what we're dealing with at this point. So how do we address the new abnormal? Now, when this first started, before vaccinations were available with my small congregation, we were very active in terms of education. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, my work at CTS helped to really, my congregation knows all about vaccination clinics. And I helped multiple congregations associated with CTS to also host vaccination clinics. And so we had a steady flow of information, and we still have updates each and every Sunday. But one of the things that we did at the onset, when we were all wrestling with this idea of whether or not vaccines were safe, is we had a time of testimony. I had members that were afraid. So after service, we would, somebody would say, well, I got a vaccination and this is the way I felt and this is what happened. And I found that the testimonies were very encouraging to the entire congregation. And I think we, particularly in Black neighborhoods, we probably need to encourage more. I think there's still a significant population that is unvaccinated. I know I've been to a few sites, and we've got to identify ways of supporting these smaller congregations to be able to be encouragers. Are you engaged in any way in the vaccination effort or education around COVID and the vaccinations?
I mean, we haven't done a lot of work around that. I mean, mostly because, the congregation I serve is very pro-vaccine. I mean, so basically in the beginning, when it was hard to get an appointment, it was hard to get in, right? I had people during fellowship hour after church on Zoom saying, hey, if you fit these categories, call this number and you'll be able to get it. I mean, it was like, they were all trading tips on where you could go and how you could get vaccinated. So, I will say, I think we wanted to leave some time for people to have Q&A. You and I, we could talk all day, but I do want to tell this story about from the history of Wellington, because I think in some ways it's a story I first heard about Wellington when I was a seminary student 20 years ago, and it stuck with me. Wellington, in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s, Wellington shared its worship space with Good Shepherd Parish, which was a GLBT. Well, back then, in those days, they were just gay and lesbian churches. They weren't, they didn't have all the fancy letters. And there were some members at Wellington who had AIDS, who were HIV positive and had full-blown AIDS and died. And one of the stories that is told from the community's life at that time is that, it is the tradition of this community that everyone comes and stands in a circle and gathers around the table. And there would be the little individual cups would have grape juice in it, but the two chalices would have wine. And the practice is that you pass the chalice around the circle, right? Wipe and pass and, hand to hand. And gosh, that sounds so super germy in this day and age. But, back in the early 90s, there was a church member who had AIDS, and the community just shifted so that he always got the common cup first, because people understood that they might have a little cold or a sniffle or a bug that might be death dealing for him. And so they realized that although, he had this disease, that there was so much fear of transmission, and, they knew, for the safety of the community and for his well-being, the most vulnerable one was always served first, and then the cup would travel to everyone else. I love that about this community, that is their lived practice, that, it's the most vulnerable one that we have to think of first.
Yes.
It's like Bonhoeffer said, if we think of our community like a chain, right? It is the weakest link in the chain that needs the most care and attention, because that is the place that community is most likely to break. And so, as we live into this new normal, as we live into this, ongoing global health pandemic, how do we continue to lift that up, and to also be aware that there are seen and unseen levels of vulnerability in all of our congregations, and how do we be attentive to all of those, right? Folks who are immunocompromised, folks who are caregivers, folks with really young children. I mean, I would love to hear how folks have supported families with really young kids. I think, their burden has been so heavy during this time, right? So heavy, so isolating. So.
And so, as you have mentioned, if any of you who are gathered here today have questions, we will open up the conversation to you, or comments, questions or comments. Any questions or comments, observations? Have Catherine, who has said her current congregation gave up the common cup before.
I think she meant to say before she arrived.
Before I arrived, yeah. Sorry, we're all getting so good at doing this in the chat that you guys are opening up the mic and we're all like, oh no, we're doing okay over here, except we can't spell fast enough.
Okay.
I just want to thank maybe both of you for bringing up so many things that I think any of us who are clearly part of any church and the wider community, period, in almost any way we serve the community. I know some folks who are in, senior services kinds of things, and they have been facing the same kind of issues we have. Things like even Meals on Wheels, they lost volunteers because people were even afraid to go to the door to drop off, things. So, I think you guys are discussing in very wonderful and practical and affirming ways what we've all been going through, and we are at kind of another one of those. And I hear you, Anne Louise, another pivot point. Some of the language, we talk about bandwidths all the time. Some of my people who cannot do computers for life know what bandwidth means, because it's part of our language these days. That we're at another one of those pivot points where we need to figure out what's going on. I know we closed down for Omicron for about 6 weeks, and we came back a couple of weeks ago, and a few of my folks were like, well, we could wait till Lent starts the beginning of March. And I was like, why is that? Well, it's been kind of convenient to just show, and we're do radio, so it's harder even so, because I don't know for sure who's there and who isn't there. And a lot of them text me afterwards and, at least let me know. But, a couple of them were like, well, it's been kind of easy. And I'm like going, okay, well, the radio will continue, but that's not the reason why we shut down, because it's easier. We shut down because it was dangerous to be open. So, we're dealing with that though. We've found out that we can, to a certain extent, get fed. Even we little teeny tiny pocket progressive Christians, not the big Catholic or big evangelical, folks who have lots of options on TV on Sunday morning, that we too can do that. But we also have folks who are like, I need to be back. I need to see my people. I need to be in my space. And while we own, we don't own, we never own a sacred space, but while we have a sacred space, need to be there. So last couple of weeks, it's only been 6, 8, 10 of us maybe, at church on Sunday, but that's part of why, we are church, is that people we talk about the fact that we need to be in community. And especially for some of my folks who don't do internet and don't know how to do a Zoom and whatever, we mask up and we go. So, but thank you.
I see Marva Coleman.
Yes. Good morning, everyone. It's nice to be with you all. I have the pleasure of having a number of friends in different church faith groups. And the one that I like a lot is where my son is in Little Rock, Arkansas. He's a member, well, he's now a deacon. He's a member of the Second Baptist Church, and they never stopped worship. The very first sign or decision about COVID, they moved to the parking lot. And they moved to the platform in front of the door church, set up microphones, wore their masks, sat in their cars, had a radio station, streamed to the radio car. But of course, they could hear also from outside with the loudspeakers. And they never missed a beat with any worship protocol or service. They did baptism outside and everything. And I guess they have the advantage of warm weather too.
Yes.
I was gonna say Arkansas.
Yeah, that made a difference too. But
Yeah.
I've seen all forms of people doing different things to combat the virus. I live in Gary, so I have friends that belong to various churches. I'm a member of Trinity, of course. Trinity, we have our ways of continuing our worship, doing a lot of virtual. I have not missed a choir rehearsal in 2 years.
All
We
right.
do choir rehearsal on Zoom. And so we had one last night that we're doing with the main church. And then we're sending in, voices with a song for Amistad. And so tomorrow night we have choir rehearsal. And so we will review our participation in the main church. And so I'm just very thankful that we're safe and we're still here. And I just lament the fact that so many millions had to die
Yeah.
because of various reasons that you all know of.
Yeah.
Your digital pastor, and in many ways, Trinity was ahead of the game.
Yeah.
Your digital pastor, Reverend Jasmine, was one of our key facilitators as we were training other faith leaders on how to deal with virtual worship. She was a tremendous blessing to us and to a group we call Black Faith Leader Collective. And she has helped me out tremendously in terms of how I'm doing work with my ministry. So I do appreciate you and the Trinity family because it was definitely a major adjustment. Trinity was a little larger and you had an established program and an infrastructure. We were dealing with many congregations with 150 members or less. And so we had to work to get them up to par, and we did. And all of them have decent digital ministries at this point. I'm proud and happy that CTF was a part of that process.
You know what? I just want to jump in and say, we actually did something during COVID. We held a joint worship service with a UCC congregation in Queens, New York. And they were, they are doing live worship on Zoom, just like we were. We actually connected because they had a minister who was writing a paper on like congregations that were involved in environmental justice. And I guess she called the national office and said, what are some churches I should talk to? And I'm stunned to this day that they were like, oh, you should go talk to the people at Wellington. Because when we had a building, we did put solar panels on the roof. And they're still there, being a gift to the people who own that building now. But yeah, so we connected. And so here we had two small congregations in urban areas that were the inverse of each other racially, right? So their congregation is like 85% African-American, 15% other. We are 85% Caucasian and 15% African American. But since we were, both congregations were doing live worship on Zoom, we actually had a joint worship service together one Sunday morning where we all piled on the same Zoom link, and we had shared music from Chicago and Queens, and a shared sermon that went back and forth between us. I mean, it was great. It was great.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I know that we're very close to the end of our session. Thank you so much, my fellow alum, Reverend Hawk. Appreciate you and
Appreciate
all that
you.
you're doing. And thank you all for participating. I'm going to turn it back over to Lisa.
Thanks, Brian. Yes, thank you, Anne Louise, for being with us today. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, everyone, for engaging with the chat. These are definitely changing times, right? And I love that normal has broken up with us. Anne Louise, I'm just hanging on to that. So this was helpful for me in thinking not only about worship spaces and ministry, but just life in general and how we navigate this, and conversations about consent and caring for the most vulnerable around us. So I really appreciate this opportunity and all of your good thoughts and thinking together and collective wisdom.